Good morning. It's Wednesday. So, being Wednesday, I'm going to continue with our Lenten lunchtime devotions. We're going to do it in this format online. Now, so far this Lent, I've been talking about fasting. We're all familiar with the idea of fasting. I'm not sure how many of us are familiar with actually doing it and following through, but we're familiar with the idea. We give up things in a fast. So either we're giving up food, often it's more giving up more luxurious food. We're going to give up chocolate or something that we appreciate, some kind of pleasure we're going to deny ourselves for a little while. And we do this during the time of Lent. Now, there are good reasons for doing such a thing. Often, I think we really take things for granted in this society. We live in a world where we've really never had it so good. We can order something from the other side of the world and it shows up at our house the next day. We eat strawberries in the dead of winter. We have every kind of convenience that we can possibly imagine. And the problem with all this convenience is we start taking things for granted. We start not only expecting that when we go to the grocery store, we're going to find tropical fruits in January, but when we don't, we actually get a little bit upset. We start getting a feeling of entitlement as though it's natural for us to get everything that our heart desires all the time. And that kind of complacency is really not a good thing in any way whatsoever. It leads us to become selfish and petty and small-minded. So the idea of a fast is to break the hold that these things have over us. That by denying ourselves, by refusing something good for a short period of time, we learn a better appreciation. Not only a better appreciation for that chocolate when we start eating it again after Lent, but we learn an appreciation for all the other more simple things that maybe we don't pay that much attention to because we're so focused on our other luxuries. So the fasting is a process of changing our sense of entitlement back into a sense of gratitude. And that's the value of fasting. It breaks the hold that these things have over us. And it changes our orientation so that we consider things a little bit different. And throughout this process, we learn that actually we don't find satisfaction through indulging our every desire, but actually through self-discipline. That ultimately it's that discipline that leads us to a greater satisfaction when we enjoy cookies on occasion instead of at every meal. And this goes along with what Paul wrote about not being conformed to the patterns of this world, those patterns of consumption and appetite that really seem to define modern society. So Lenten fasting, it's our tool. It's our discipline that we're going to use in order to get a better appreciation. Now, along with fasting from physical things, last week I had suggested that there are such things as spiritual and mental fasts. And the example that I had used last week was fasting from being offended. Now, that seems like an odd thing at first, but when we unpack it a little bit and we think about it, we realize that there actually is quite a bit of value to this. That when we're offended, it's the result of pride and it produces pride. So when we're regularly offended by people, we'll find that we start to cultivate an attitude of superiority. We have a smugness. We have an air of moral loftiness where we know we're so much better than those other people, those deplorables that are offending us all the time. So the end result of offense is pride, but the process by which we get there is also pride, because we get offended because we're thinking about ourselves too much, because we think it's all about me. So when that person cuts me off in traffic, and I think, I'm offended because they cut me off. Now, the real issue actually is that it's not about me, and maybe that's what bothers me so much, because that person who cut me off in traffic wasn't thinking about me at all. Didn't even cross his mind that I was there. That's the very thing. So it's interesting that this offense, it's an interaction of two prideful people bumping up against each other, because the other driver is thinking only about himself and where he wants to go, and he's not thinking about me. And then with myself, I'm only thinking about me and my offense and where I want to go. And so this whole idea of being offended, unless it's something intentional, but usually that's not the case. Usually our offense comes from unthinking, uncaring acts. But it's just the result of two prideful people that are so busy thinking about themselves that everything just breaks down. Now, the real truth is that instead of everything being about me, very little is actually about me. And once I start to comprehend that fact and start to live into that, I'll find that my offense levels go down. Now, C.S. Lewis wrote what I thought was a brilliant statement. He said that humility is not about thinking less of ourselves, but it's about thinking of ourselves less. And I think he was really onto something when he wrote that. So humility is not demeaning ourselves or necessarily saying that we're worse at things or worse in general than we in fact are. But it's just about thinking about ourselves less often. We should be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, because it's not all about me. So the first week of fasting that I spoke about was this idea of fasting from offense. So we're going to think of ourselves less. Now this week I'd like to talk about fasting from fear. And of course, this is very applicable to what's going on in the world today. I mean, there's a lot of fear. Certainly, this virus is creating a lot of stress, and we see that fear being played out through actions like hoarding. That's something that's becoming quite an issue. Now, this fear, just like the offense, is the result of an inordinate focus on the self. So I'm worrying far too much about what am I going to eat? What am I going to wear? What am I going to do? And this leads to these behaviors of hoarding. And as we do these things, if we go into the grocery store and we take those 4 last huge bags of dog food, even though we've got one little tiny pup, we're thinking of ourselves, we're thinking of our needs. Not only that, we're hardening our hearts to others. And then this goes back into that same situation from last week, where now we're causing offense actually through our inordinate view of ourselves. So Jesus, he asked that same question, and when we say, what are we going to eat? What are we going to wear? He says, don't worry about that. Now, why? Why does he say that? He goes on to say that we can't add an hour to our lives through worry. That our words are not going to change one hair on our heads from black into white. He's essentially saying that your fear is ineffectual, so don't give in to it. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be prudent and that we shouldn't be thinking and we shouldn't be planning, because of course all of these things are good. We're called to be wise as serpents, of course. But we're not to give in to fear, because fear is irrational. And what ends up happening when we're thinking and when we're planning, we're acting. But when we're doing things out of fear, we're reacting. We're actually no longer in control. It's the fear that's in control of us. Now that's really quite ironic, because usually when we're acting in fear, it's because we're trying to seize control. We want to take back that control and put ourselves in control. And that's why we do these things like hoarding or whatever our reaction is to fear, right? But the interesting thing is that we actually end up doing exactly the opposite of what it is that we intend. Now, Jesus came to set us free. This is what we hear when he read from the scroll in the synagogue. He read from Isaiah. And part of what he read as essentially his mission statement was that he has come to set the prisoners free. He's going to break the chains of the oppressed. Now, if we have been set free by Christ, why would we want to get back into that box again? If we are in fact free human beings and we're autonomous agents, why would we live our lives in a reactive manner? It just simply doesn't make any sense. There's a saying that a coward dies 1,000 deaths. And I think that's true. And the interesting thing about this, when we think about what happens when people worry and obsess over their fears, we find 2 things actually. One is that most of the things that we worry about don't actually come to pass. We worry about confrontations with people. We worry about running out of supplies. We worry about what's going to happen at work or in our families. And most of these fears never actually come to pass. They never manifest themselves. And if they do, we find most of the time that it's not nearly as bad as we imagine. So what that means is that this dwelling in fear, it creates this entire reality, which is real only to us, but actually is not objectively real. And that reality that we create is miserable because we are reactive, protecting ourselves. We're just living in fear. So what the Son has set free is free indeed, which means that we don't want to go back into that box. We don't want to be part of that fear. We don't want to live in fear. Fear is about our need for control, but ultimately, fear controls us. So this week of Lent, our fast is a fast from fear. Now we can't just turn it off. How do we do this? Let's listen to what Jesus said. He said, life is more than food. The body is more than clothing. So consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouses nor barns, and yet God feeds them. And of how much more value are you than the birds? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And if you're not able to do such a small thing as that, why waste time worrying about the rest? Instead, Jesus says, and this is our key, strive for God's kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. So in our fast from fear this week, we're going to strive for God's kingdom. We're going to pray for God's kingdom to be realized, both within us and within our community that we serve. I speak to you today in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.